We're so glad to be hosting this timely gathering on faithful citizenship, the moral and political choices for Catholics in the 2020 election. We're hosting it along with Georgetown's Institute of Politics and Public Service and with support from the Democracy Fund. This is our 16th virtual dialogue since COVID-19 took us online. We're so grateful to have so many people, some 1,300 of you, joining us this afternoon from around the country for this important conversation. Before each of these dialogues, I always look through the long list of names of those who signed up to be here, just because it reminds me what a diverse group us Catholics are. We're young and old, we're from varying backgrounds and communities. And at the same time, it's in our DNA to wrestle with the kind of questions that we're going to be discussing today. How to best live out the moral principles we share, like the equal dignity of every person, the priority for the poor and vulnerable, and our responsibility to pursue the common good. We're seeing a great number of just terrific online conversations right now. So many people are doing such remarkable work. Unfortunately, we also see hostility and name-calling, challenges to other people's faith and their motives, attacks and counterattacks that reflect not genuine engagement, but partisan point scoring. So here at the Initiative, what we try to add into the conversation is to do our best to bring people together across differences and divisions. There are crucial principles at stake. We recognize that, as Pope Francis says, authentic dialogue involves the ability to respect the other's point of view and to admit that it may include legitimate convictions and concerns. We think that no one should be written out of our Catholic family for how they form and follow their conscience about how to cast their ballot. Here's how bad it can get. Some would say we shouldn't have anyone in this discussion who supports former Vice President Biden because of his position on abortion issues. Others would insist that it's wrong to give a platform to supporters of President Trump because of his character, governance, and policy failures. In a closely divided Catholic community, we believe that it's better to engage than to demonize. So here we are. We're just 2 weeks out from Election Day with this polarizing presidential campaign in high gear. We remain in the thick of a global pandemic and an economic crisis, all within what Pope Francis has called a throwaway culture that too often fails to protect the most vulnerable among us, including unborn children and their mothers, migrants and refugees, the unemployed, the elderly, and so many others. Today, we're here to talk about how we as Catholics should engage in public life as faithful citizens at this charged moment, about how we can resist having our politics drive our faith and instead allow our faith to shape our politics. We've got a great group of leaders here with different backgrounds and perspectives to help us think about that. Karina Davila is a young leader on immigrant rights and the vice president of the Young Democrats of Will County, Illinois. She's also a former immigrant support coordinator for Joliet Catholic Charities on the board of her kids' Catholic school and a founding member of the Latinx Catholic Leadership Coalition. John Carr, the founder and director of our Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life here at Georgetown, who served for more than 2 decades as director of Justice, Peace, and Human Development for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and also wrote the Washington Front column and a recent major essay on faithful citizenship in America Magazine. Mary Fiorito is the Cardinal Francis George Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. She's an attorney, a pro-life leader, the former director of pro-life activities under the late Cardinal Joseph Bernardin, and the first female vice chancellor for the Archdiocese of Chicago. And Emma Green is a 2012 graduate of Georgetown University and a staff writer at The Atlantic, where she covers politics, policy, and religion. She's also the 2020 laureate of the Hunt Prize for Journalism, Arts and Letters from America Media and the Thomas More Catholic Chapel and Center at Yale. We'll have an opportunity for questions and answers from all of our panelists later on, so please send any questions you have to the email you see on the screen below. And please also share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag FaithfulCitizenship2020 and by tagging the initiative at GUCST Public Life on Twitter. And with that, let's get started. Emma, you've received the prestigious Hunt Prize from America Media and the Thomas More Center for your outstanding journalism. And if any of you haven't read Emma's just published Hunt Prize essay in America on working to build community in a nation suffering from institutional failures and widespread mistrust, please go find it as soon as we're done here. But Emma, you've quickly become a really widely respected reporter at the intersection of faith and politics, and someone who's respected by conservatives and progressives alike. You're also doing groundbreaking reporting on Catholics and the issues that are important to us in this election. What's going on with U.S. Catholic voters? How are the presidential campaigns reaching out to them? What effects are they having? And how might Catholics be decisive voters in the 2020 presidential election?
Well, thanks, Kim. And I have to say, I am delighted to be virtually back at Georgetown. It would be nice to be on campus again, but I'm always delighted to join my alma mater for conversations like this. There are a few numbers that stick out to me when I am thinking about the landscape of Catholic voters in the United States. The first is a sort of 50-50 split that we see in the partisan identification of Catholics in the United States. Basically, Catholics in the US are split like Solomon's baby right down the middle between the two parties. And we see again and again in presidential election years that they are the ultimate swing constituency. I was doing research for a recent piece and found that in 3/4 of the last presidential elections over the last 50 years, Catholics sided with the winner. So you can see why presidential candidates would be eager to recruit Catholic voters to their cause. In 2016, we saw that white Catholics potentially made the difference in the election. Roughly 56% of white Catholics ended up voting for President Trump in 2016. And we see that made a huge margin in particular states such as Pennsylvania, which has a historic population of white Catholics, Irish, Italian, and Polish. Because of this, I recently went to Pennsylvania to do a little bit of reporting in Scranton in Northeast Pennsylvania, where two counties, Lackawanna and Luzerne, which have traditionally been Democratic strongholds, have gotten really mighty thin in terms of their margins for Democrats. And Joe Biden is trying to sell his affinity with this region of the country. He grew up in Scranton for the first part of his childhood as a way of connecting with Catholic voters. His campaign explicitly has said that his faith identity is a way that he may win back some of those voters who went for Trump in 2016. He often talks on the campaign trail about the IHM nuns who taught him when he was a kid. He talks about Catholic social teaching. So there's a real clear pitch that Democrats, and specifically Biden, are trying to make as he vies to become the second Catholic president in American history. But on the other side, we see that the Republican Party and the Trump campaign is also really intentionally trying to reach out to Catholic voters. We see this specifically in recent weeks around Judge Amy Coney Barrett trying to send a message to Catholic voters that Trump has delivered on judges and appointing people who share their values. Amy Coney Barrett is a Catholic. And we also see that there's a lot of fear around what a Biden administration might do. I emailed back and forth with the columnist George Weigel, who's one of Mary's colleagues at the EPPC, who was saying that he was troubled by the fact that Joe Biden might in fact continue a legal case against the Little Sisters of the Poor once he gets in office. And he credited President Trump for his advances on religious freedom and for his appointments to the judiciary. So there's a case being made on both sides. And ultimately, for me, the takeaway is that there's a lot of focus on Catholic voters. The one final point that I'll make is that in terms of those numbers that stick out, you can't discount the difference between white Catholics and Latino Catholics. We have roughly 57% of white Catholics in the United States identifying as Republican, and nearly 68% of Latino Catholics identifying as Democrats. So there's a real split in the party along race and along sort of the future, where different kinds of Catholics see the future of the party and or the future of the country, and which party they think is going to deliver on that.
Thanks so much for that, Emma. That's a great way to start us off. And one thing I take away is that the Catholic vote is split, it's complicated, and it's really important. And with that, I want to turn to you, John, because before founding the initiative, you served the U.S. Bishops' Conference as the Director of Justice, Peace, and Human Development. And you helped them develop this document that we've been talking about, Faithful Citizenship, on Catholics' political responsibilities. You've recently written a long essay for America Magazine about the history and moral criteria of faithful citizenship. Can you tell us about that history and the set of criteria and how it shapes the choices of Catholic voters in this election?
Sure. As Emma was talking about the 50-50 makeup of the Catholic community, I was thinking of my own family. I come from a bipartisan marriage, a mixed marriage. My mother's family, very Republican. My dad's family, very Democratic. So I learned at an early age that we can express our faith in different ways. Seems to me that Emma said that Biden's appeal is personal and Trump's appeal is transactional, what he's going to do for us. What the bishops want us to be is principle, neither of those two. And so literally, I've been involved for the last 45 years. I want to be modest about this. I was the staff person helping the bishops. They work on these statements more than any other. And over the years, 12 different statements, they moved from political responsibility to faithful citizenship to forming consciousness for faithful citizenship, from 3,500 words to 17,000 words. We can debate whether that's helped or hurt. But there have been some real consistencies. These documents are not a traditional voter's guide. They're not a scorecard, a menu, a checklist of issues. They have consistently said we're not single issue voters. In 2007, the process changed, the title changed, and the content changed. It became forming consciousness based on Pope Benedict's description of the church's task. And it focused primarily on the prudence and conscience. Conscience, what we hear in our heart, what our faith compels us to do, and prudence, how we act on it. And they warned us against making no distinctions between issues, but also saying that if we focus on evils, nothing else matters. They outlined, in a real sense, what the church should be, which is political but not partisan, principled but not ideological, civil but not silent, and engaged but not used. And their fundamental message was the Catholics have a moral obligation to participate. It turns out that the most countercultural thing the church teaches in this area may not be that all life is sacred. It may not be that the poor ought to come first or the war ought to be a last resort. It's that politics is a good thing and we have an obligation to participate.
Thanks for that background, John. Mary, let's turn to you. You are the Cardinal George Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. You're an attorney and a pro-life leader. Your dad was a Democratic precinct captain. You're a lifelong Chicagoan. You've been in leadership roles in the church and in the pro-life movement. So in the latest version of Faithful Citizenship, the U.S. Catholic bishops recognize that political choices lie with each of us, and they say that the threat of abortion remains our preeminent priority. And they also call on Catholics to assess candidates' character, commitments, and integrity. Given all of that, why should Catholic voters vote for President Trump over former Vice President Biden?
Well, I'd start with a couple of things. First of all, as you mentioned, I grew up in a Democratic family. My father was a precinct captain. I lived on Chicago's West Side in the same parish Bob Newhart grew up in, and also Andy Greeley, oddly enough. So my parents are both immigrants. They came to the United States from a country where Christmas wasn't even a legal holiday until 1954 because it was considered papist. And so a large part of the reason that they left is because my father had a very Catholic sounding surname and couldn't get jobs and housing and just tremendous discrimination. So they really came here for primarily religious liberty reasons. And so for a family like ours to have to move to the Republican Party to cast ballots is a serious and significant thing. The very first campaign I worked on right out of graduate school was that of Glenn Poshard, who was a pro-life congressman from Illinois' 22nd district. He ran for governor against a pro-life Republican. We had two pro-lifers in Illinois, believe it or not, running against each other. Poshard very narrowly lost, and now George Ryan's in prison. So that didn't end well. But then I volunteered later for Robert Casey's presidential campaign, which was a great joy. And the last campaign I volunteered for was that of my high school classmate, Dan Lipinski. We've been friends since we were 15, so I'm very close to him. And I saw, because of that, I saw what the party did to him from the inside. I mean, $3 million coming into the abortion industry to defeat a man who 90% of the time voted with Nancy Pelosi. He is a Democrat. He's not a fake Republican. He's not any of that. And Kristen Day from Democrats for Life and I pounded the pavement on Chicago's southwest side. But, our polls were closed for COVID, and that kept a lot of the elderly people away, or rather there was limited polling available, and it was too dangerous for the elderly. And I think that's why he lost. But now, oddly enough, we're seeing the Republican candidate in that district, who I think may take Marie Newman. He's within 2 percentage points of her, apparently. So that just gives you a little bit of my own personal journey in this regard. And, I came to work. Cardinal Bernardine, when I graduated from law school, asked me if I would take over his pro-life office. And I did so because I had a great love for his consistent ethic. It made sense to me morally. It made sense to me legally. It made sense to me ethically. And one of the things Cardinal Bernardine said, and this is, public knowledge, it's in interviews, you can't subscribe to the consistent ethic and then vote for somebody who believes that abortion is a basic right for the individual, because the consequence of that is a lack of legal protection for the unborn. And what, for me, it's not so much a vote for Trump, but when I look at Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's platform, they are not neutral on abortion. But Joe Biden has publicly said he wants to bring back Roe versus Wade and codify it as the law of the land. And for those non-attorneys who are listening, that means everything that we gained with the Casey decision, we lose. So abortion for all 9 months, for any reason, including sex selection abortions, late-term abortions for babies who are already viable. And I'm talking about healthy moms carrying healthy babies. I'm not talking about sick and disabled children, who, of course, are also kind of special targets in that. So their position isn't neutral on abortion. They want to repeal the Hyde Amendment, which we know has saved at least 60,000 lives, according to the lowest statistical figures. So this is really an administration that's not neutral. And what I have been increasingly uncomfortable with, and if any of you are involved with Democrats for Life, you'll understand this. Kristen Day asked Pete Buttigieg during the primaries, is there room for pro-life Democrats in the party? And he said, no, there's not. There really, if you do not believe in our plank of abortion on demand, it went from safe, legal, and rare, which I think people could, agree with, to all 9 months for any reason, and the taxpayers will pay for it. So that's the kind of extremism that pushed a lifelong Democrat like me into voting for President Trump.
Thanks for that, Mary. I appreciate it. Karina, let's turn to you. You're a young Catholic leader. You work for immigrant rights, and you've worked for Catholic Charities, and you're also a leader in a Young Democrats group. I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked Mary, but in reverse. Given Catholic teachings on our political responsibilities and the U.S. Bishop's guidance, why should Catholic voters vote for former Vice President Biden over President Trump?
Thank you for that question. First of all, it's great to be here with you all, and those of you that are watching. As a Catholic, I have accepted the invitation of the bishops of the United States and educated myself about what is at stake. It is naive and almost irresponsible to think that there is only one issue that defines an election. This has never in the history of our nation or any other democracy, and will never ever be the case. The bishops clearly call all Catholics that we must vote, but they do not tell us who and should not tell us who to vote for. This is a personal decision based on our conscience. It is also clear that as Catholics, we are to look at what makes us a nation. How candidates and their platforms must honor the best of who we are, be truthful, and build the common good. As a Democrat, I know that I have a responsibility to participate in the political system of our nation. We do not live in a country where only one party has the answers to what we should be. In the United States of America, it is the people who have the voice. Everyone has a voice, and this is something that I emphasize in. Not only the rich and powerful elites or the religious powers that want to co-opt people's conscience by instilling fear. It's everyone. I have an obligation to pass judgment with my vote of how one political party and one president that shows little allegiance to anyone but himself has destroyed many social institutions for which many generations fought, cried, and gave their lives. I cannot remain silent or blind to these realities. First of all, I want my country back. For me, for my daughters, for the young people coming right after me, and for the next generations of immigrants and refugees. In conscience, I cannot vote for a man who is the opposite of nearly everything that is human and Christian. So why should I vote for Biden, you ask? Because on nearly every account, Trump has failed the American nation and has failed the Catholic world by promoting racism, implicity, and explicity. In my opinion, it's horrendous. Trump has failed the American nation and has failed the Catholic world by using the pro-life cause to advance his interests, arguing that he is against abortion, yet his administration restored the federal death penalty. He has created conditions for the lives of immigrants and refugees to be threatened and wants to take away basic health care away from millions of people, including the most young and poor. Trump has failed the American nation and has failed the Catholic world by lying, distorting reality, disregarding the advice of scientists and advisors, and making a mockery of the presidency of the United States. Biden is not perfect, and no candidate is. The Democrats are definitely not perfect, and no one will claim that. Yet the decision is clear for me. Biden is the best choice that Catholics and the American people have in 2020.
Thanks for that, Karina. I appreciate it. John, I want to go back to you real quickly. In your article, you talk about how you're deciding to vote this time. You come out at a little bit of a different place, I think, than either Karina or Mary. Can you tell us a little bit more about where you are?
Well, I actually identified with the case that both Mary and Karina made against the two parties. But in the end, I think we have to choose because I think the stakes are really high. I don't think bishops or pastors or church officials should be telling us how to vote. What's Pope Francis' line? They should be forming consciences, not replacing them. But I'm not a bishop, I'm not a pastor, and I'm not a church official anymore. And so I thought I would try to use the principles of faithful citizenship to think through how I would vote in this context. And in the middle of the document, I think it's paragraphs 34 to 37, it outlines fairly specific criteria that there are intrinsic evils and you can't vote for someone who supports those intrinsic evils if your intent is to support that position. You can vote for someone who's involved in an intrinsic evil for other morally grave reasons, and that you should decide to vote for the candidate deemed less likely to advance that evil and more likely to pursue other human goods. So what's a pro-life, social justice, consistent ethic Catholic to do? For me, there are two intrinsic evils that are front and center. One is abortion, one is racism. We know the extremism of the Democratic Party, and frankly, Biden has caved into that. What President Trump used to be pro-choice, but now has delivered in a variety of ways. For me, a decisive issue is racism. Trump has demonized immigrants. He fans the flames of racism. He refuses to denounce extremist groups. He's seeking to divide the country by race. Biden is trying to bring people together, acknowledges systemic racism, has chosen the first Black female vice president. And so for me, electing a president who will fight racism rather than make it worse is a moral imperative. We vote for candidates, not issues. So what the bishops say about character and integrity is really important. I think President Trump, for the reasons that have been outlined, lacks the character, frankly, lacks the competence, lacks the integrity to lead us where we need to go. And I don't think Joe Biden is perfect by any means, but he holds more potential to bring us together to accomplish some things. I vote for him in spite of his position on abortion, and that imposes responsibilities on me to resist that policy agenda if he becomes president.
Thanks, John. And Mary, let's go back to you with this. I'd like to give you a chance to respond. You made a very strong case. Abortion is clearly a grave injustice in our law. Can you talk a little bit more about your reaction to what you've heard here so far?
I want to kind of address some of the things that John raises, very prudently. And I'll kind of start with his last one first. To go to kind of character and competence issues, I do think, when people are voting for president, it's not voting for your pastor. I've never looked to a president to be a moral guide for me. Now, that's not to excuse bad or ungentlemanly or unchristian behavior. I wouldn't do that. But I think there's a little bit more emphasis than is needed for Catholics, certainly. We don't look to the president. We look to the Holy Father for moral guidance. We look to our bishops. So that issue for me is a little bit of a red herring. Second, if I could go to the racism issue, as I mentioned from the outset, I live in Chicago. I'm not sure how many of you fully understand the summer that we had here in Chicago. Hundreds of people murdered, hundreds. Including a 7-year-old girl that was shot in the forehead riding her bike on the 4th of July, about 4 blocks where I lived when I was 7. An 8-year-old girl shot in the back while she was driving in a car with her mother. An 18-month-old boy shot in his car seat while he was sitting waiting with his mother. My guess is, except for perhaps Karina, who lives in the area, most of you never even heard about those stories. That's just Tuesday in Chicago. Chicago's beautiful Michigan Avenue torched. The Daughters of St. Paul, their beautiful Michigan Avenue bookstore, ransacked, and the terrified sisters cowering upstairs. And then after everything had finally been repaired and Michigan Avenue rebuilt, it happened again. Stores being looted. And President Trump offered, I think, and the police were grateful for it. My parish I grew up in was a very big police and fire department parish because it was right on the edge of the city. I don't know one police officer who's voting for Joe Biden. When they saw at the Democratic convention that the violence was not explicitly condemned and that it was not even addressed, incredibly discouraging. Our Chicago police have not been able to take a day off. I think in 4 months now, they work 12-hour shifts every day, no vacation, no sick days. People had to cancel weddings. So that violence that wasn't addressed is a real issue. When Kenosha, Wisconsin, which is like Mayberry, gets torched and looted, things are bad. And does that have racial undertones? But when the president offers to send in help and then your Democratic mayor uses an expletive to tell him no, you talk about civil discourse being cheapened. That was very, very difficult for the people here I know, who just made them more resolute to vote for the president's reelection.
Emma, I'd love to go to you with that. I'd love to hear your reaction, kind of wrapping up what we've heard so far. I'm struck by the fact that when I hear Mary and Karina and John talking, that they're coming from their communities, and you just wrote so beautifully about people's communities and about the mistrust and our institutional failure there. I wonder if any of that is reflected in what you're hearing as well.
I think this conversation in many ways is a model of something that we don't see very often, especially during this era of American politics, which is people coming together from very, very different perspectives and trying to have a conversation to share their points of view. I do think that in general, our greatest political challenge right now is that people who sit on different sides of the political spectrum, who identify with different parties, and certainly who are supporting different candidates for president, generally are speaking 100% different languages around the types of issues that they think are important, the type of urgency that they see. I was struck in this conversation hearing all of the different panelists speak with this sense that this is an election that could really change everything, but the reasons there and the issues there that are being listed are radically different. And so what's interesting to me, sort of bringing this full circle, is how all of this could exist in one Catholic church under a roof of people who very much share a faith and who share certain principles and teachings. In terms of the way that politics has seeped in, I think the Catholic Church is a really great example. Catholics in the United States are more Republicans and Democrats really than they are Catholics when it comes to how they vote. It's not necessarily the most helpful frame to say, how am I going to vote as a Catholic, but more, how am I voting according to the sensibility that I see in terms of my general partisan affiliation. So I do think that when we're thinking about American communities, when I'm looking at American communities, reporting on different churches and parishes, the way that different Catholic leaders are speaking into public life, that's always a frame that I have going in the back of my mind is, what are the issues that have been put in the back of different voters and different leaders' minds as being the most urgent and the most important? And how did those issues get there? Often partisanship is actually the most important hint at the way that people's consciousnesses or the way that their mindsets have been shaped.
Thanks for that. Karina, let me go to you now. We've heard a lot about different perspectives on how to vote. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how your community drives, how you think about these issues, and also the responsibilities of Catholics in the face of the kind of division and polarization that we're seeing out there. What can we bring to the conversation in response to this?
Sure. I think for me, specifically with the community that I work with, as soon as Trump was elected into office, we were inundated with like phone calls of people in fear, specifically with the immigration community, the immigrant community, who did not know what was going to happen. Both of my parents were born in Mexico. They came here to the U.S. and I had not endured any of the experiences that I was able to experience with the community that I was working with. It's so much to the point where we had calls constantly about, mothers and fathers who were scared of not coming back to their homes, of getting pulled over or being deported, scared of not knowing what was going to happen to their children. For me, I'm a mom. I have 2 daughters, and I cannot imagine, going out the door, going out to work, and not knowing if I'm going to come back, or not knowing what's going to happen to my children. And for me, that is something that I know I don't want to live for another 4 years of fear, another 4 years of the community living in fear. The history of those 4 years that I spent with the immigrant community, it was, every day was an emotional roller coaster. We had, because of, and many of you probably know, and those of you that don't, when public charge was being talked about, what was going to happen, and for you that don't know, is public charge, when you come to the US, the government pretty much looks at your record and will say, okay, is this going to be a public charge to the community? Yes or no? And there are certain rules that go with it. Whether you apply for any government aid, you're a public charge. So it was like 2 weeks that we did not know what was going to go into public charge or what the new rules were. And a lot of families just went and pulled their kids away from Medicaid. A lot of moms stopped going and asking for WIC. And what was troubling to me is that I worked with a lot of domestic violence organizations who started seeing a decrease in phone calls and started seeing a decrease on people showing up. And that to me was, that was a fear. Now we are creating a community who lives in fear, who doesn't have any basic needs as healthcare, as any counseling. So that to me is something that I know I do not want to continue living for another 4 years.
John, I'm really struck by how both Mary and Karina come at this from the experience of their communities. And I want to pick up on something you said earlier. You said that our responsibilities as Catholics don't end in the voting booth, but they begin there. So wherever we're going with our vote and however we're supporting our communities, and we have a responsibility to our larger Catholic community and our larger national community in some ways to react and respond to the different parties and how they differ from Catholic social teaching. What would you say about that? Like, what does a Catholic Republican or Democrat do after this election?
Well, I think about my own family. My mother started the Pro-Life Pregnancy Center in our hometown. Her uncle was the Republican leader of the Minnesota Senate. I'll just be blunt. I think she would think that President Trump represents the worst of her party and is making her party go places we shouldn't go. When Trump talks about Cory Booker putting housing projects in the suburbs, he's not talking about zoning policy. He's talking about racism. When he talks about demonization. So my mother would want her party, and I would say to Republicans, and I'm sure Mary's a part of this, that if Trump wins, they have to break free from this leader who seeks to divide us on almost everything. And frankly, human life is at stake, but 220,000 people have died because of incompetence and delay on coronavirus. I'm more clear. I've said I'm going to vote for Biden. My decision is clear, but it's not without some serious problems. We have an obligation to make clear if Biden wins, it's not a mandate for abandoning the Hyde Amendment or undermining Catholic ministries that serve the poor. I don't think it's at all a given that the Hyde Amendment is going to go away. I think if Trump is sort of the worst of his party, I think Biden in the primaries represented something different in his party. This is not a woke candidate who wants to destroy religion. This is somebody who came from a family of faith. You can debate how he lives it out, but Joe Biden will try and bring us together. There's a battle for the soul of the country. I also think there's a battle for the soul of the Democratic and Republican Party, and Catholics ought to be in the middle of that, trying to stand up for human life and dignity wherever it's threatened.
So thanks for that, John. And we've heard a lot of different, very principled reactions to our question that we posed here today. I want to end this portion of our discussion, and we're going to move on to questions and answers from you all who are viewing, and asking you all relatively quickly. We talk about Catholics being politically homeless, that neither party really reflects the fullness of Catholic social teaching. Some people are asking, what about voting for a third party, or what about not voting at all? What are your reactions to that? And maybe, Mary, I'll start with you.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people feel that a third party vote is actually a vote for President Trump, because most of the people tending to be inclined to vote third party may have been Biden voters. That's my sense of it, at least from reading some of the studies. But, I think when we're talking about issues like racism and, service to the poor, we also have to think about school choice. And our public school students, many of them locked into failing schools, they are discriminated against because of their zip codes. And I have seen on the part of the Trump administration a real desire to take that as one of the most discriminatory policies. And now, I was at my hairdresser's the other day. She's a lovely young woman, was born in Mexico. She's a single mom, and she has a special needs child who has to learn at home on a computer, because now the teacher unions are saying they won't open until the end of next year. So you have thousands of these schools. She can't afford a Catholic school. And to give the power back to the parents to choose the type of educational institution that is best for their child, that you talk about a way out of poverty and a way to end some racism, because unfortunately, even our Catholic schools, even though we do yeoman's work to keep our schools open in the inner city, at the end of the day, we're not a bank, and that's very difficult to do unless you have a lot of money, or you have a government that will give parents the power and the authority to choose a school for their child. And what's the greatest indicator that someone will live in poverty? They don't graduate from high school, they have a child before they're married, and they have never had a job before the age of 20. I mean, if you do the reverse of those three things, you're almost guaranteed never to live in poverty, as all the studies have shown us. So I think you see from President Trump's administration a real desire to create jobs in the trades and in entry-level organizations and businesses where people can get a real foot in the door and get that first step into the American dream. And, these opportunity zones that he's been working on in urban areas have been a tremendous boon. And I have been really surprised by the number of my African-American friends who have voted for Trump the last time and will do so again. As I have a Black Protestant pastor friend who said to me, listen, a civil right doesn't mean a whole lot to a dead Black baby. So, we have to put life first.
Karina, what about you? Do you think that it's an option for Catholics to vote for a third party, or to just not vote because we don't have options that satisfy us across the board?
First of all, I think not voting is a horrible mistake that we can make. I agree with Mary. We need to go out and vote, especially within the Latinx community. We have every 30 seconds a young individual turns 18. Every 30 seconds, someone in the Latinx community turns 18. And I think this election is going to particularly be important, especially in the minority community. And, we look into the policies that Trump is proposing, and all the budget cuts he has done has been towards offices that help specifically minority communities, specifically the poor. We've seen cut and SNAP benefits. We've seen, we are seeing a proposing cut in week in breastfeeding counselors. And this is devastating. Also, when we're starting to see affordable housing, we look at the budget that we had and we look at the budget that is being proposed, and it is scary. We are starting to see, okay, so, the Republican Party is for life, yet we have all these life issues that are so important. I mean, where are we going to live? How are we going to get, healthcare or basic needs? Somebody who cannot afford to go out and buy food on their own. And a lot of times they're seeing as a burden. And, for me personally, I know that I've come a long way since, I started, with my education. And I've needed these from these, government programs, and they have helped me. So I think that when we look at life issues, we need to look at life in its entirety, not just in abortion.
Thanks for that. That's great, Karina. John, how about you? Do you have anything to add on this issue?
Well, quickly, I actually voted for Mary's old boss, Cardinal Bernardine, for president once. I was so frustrated with the choices. And I told him I had voted for him. And he said, "Oh, John, I couldn't serve. Clerics can't be in partisan offices." And I said, "Cardinal, you didn't win. In my precinct, you got beat 2-1 by Mickey Mouse." I think that was a luxury we can't afford right now. I think the stakes are too high, frankly. I think a lot of people 4 years ago said, Clinton's going to win. Maybe I'll do a protest vote. Maybe I won't vote. And the consequences of that decision are great. I think Catholics have a responsibility to engage and persuade and not sit back and judge. So in this case, when there is so much at stake, I think even though the choices are challenging, we ought to reflect on what our faith requires, make a choice, defend our choice. We also ought to respect the choices of others. I'm not going to tell other people in my parish that they have to vote my conscience instead of theirs.
Thanks for that. And thanks to all of you. That was wonderful. I want to move now to our questions and answers from those of you who are, or questions, from those of you who are watching out there today. And Emma, I'm going to bring this first one to you because it's reflected in a lot of the questions and somebody asked it directly. They say, what press are you reading and taking in? In other words, that each person here seems to be reading in some sort of a silo where they're reading and taking in information. And excuse me, not you all here, but in general, Democrats, Republicans, Catholics seem to be in different silos in terms of the media they consume. How does that affect people's votes? Do you find that to be true in your reporting? What can we do to combat that?
I think the fractured media landscape is absolutely a huge factor in the kind of ribbedness that we see in so many aspects of American life. The sense of talking past one another that I described earlier, I think, is absolutely created and exacerbated by having different sets of facts, that there are partisan media outlets that tend to emphasize all of the failures of President Trump while touting the successes of Democrats. And on the other side, saying that Trump can do no wrong. I think in general, it's really important for every citizen to read widely and voraciously, to try to venture across party lines into different types of media, and also to recognize that there are not multiple sets of facts, that there is truth. And for all that, for example, conservatives may have trouble with the New York Times and detecting bias, a sense that there's an anti-Trump spin, I do think that newspapers like that are just unparalleled in the sense that they go out and do the hard work of finding information. There's a lot of valuable information presented in papers like that. The only other thing I would say is that I think in this time, it's really important to maybe turn off the TV. I think often it's undercounted the extent to which television news can be more entertainment and debate than it is necessarily trying to inform news audiences. So I would recommend getting that New York Times subscription, reading widely across the internet in many, many different perspectives and publications, trying to really educate yourself widely. And most of all, trying to go out and meet and talk to people who are unlike yourself in order to get a sense of other perspectives and really humanize some of these stories that can demonize people with different points of view.
Thanks, Emma. We're getting so many questions in that I'm sorry for not naming the people who are submitting them, but I'm trying to combine them so we can get to as many as possible. And we have people saying on one side that we're not talking about climate change here and all, when that's such an important issue. And we have others saying we haven't even mentioned religious liberty in any significant way so far. What about other issues that we haven't touched on here today? How should those weigh in how we think about this? Mary, why don't I start with you?
Okay, thank you. One of the issues I think that's of great importance to a lot of people, although it seems to be one of those under the surface issues, is that of the COVID lockdowns and the schools in particular staying closed. I heard a very interesting interview with a public defender who has never voted Republican in her entire life. And she is going to vote for President Trump for the first time, her very first time in her adult life to vote for a Republican. And she's doing it largely because, as a public defender, she is seeing the tremendous negative effects in the criminal justice system for the people of color that she represents. So these are people who cannot afford attorneys. She is representing them. She said the mental health issues that have arisen, not just among the high school students themselves who are particularly hard hit by social isolation, but also for their working parents, like the woman who was doing my hair the other day, how she is finding someone to watch her daughter to sit and look at a screen all day long instead of being engaged in a classroom. And some of in major urban areas, poor families also rely on public schools for breakfast and lunch for their children. The national mask mandate seems to be a point of real contention. There are, I guess, conflicting studies about how effective the mask is, and I think those need to be looked at by experts in the type of medicine that involves and the spread of disease, and epidemiologists really need to look at that because there's a great resentment, and then just businesses not being able to function. Chicago, which was once probably the second most famous restaurant town in the city, we've lost at least 10 of my favorite restaurants are closing and they're not coming back. An old Jewish jewelry store, 100 years on Chicago's Mag Mile, they were looted twice. They were not coming back. Their insurance will not cover those losses. So the impact on business, I think, is going to be very critical in people's decision-making.
Thanks, Mary. John, you talk, I know, a lot about COVID in your piece. What do you think about both the COVID-19 crisis and other issues that are affecting the election?
COVID is a fundamental issue of life and death. 220,000 people are not coming back. Masks are a pro-life step. I don't think there's much dispute that masks keep us from hurting ourselves and infecting others. It ought to be something we do to try and help us survive as a society. My image that I keep coming back to is Pope Francis' metaphor of the throwaway society, whether it's unborn children, whether it's the undocumented, whether it's the elderly and COVID, whether it's the environment. We are a society that often puts things ahead of people. And the thread that runs through this is respect for human life and dignity, and the idea that people and God's creation are more important than our partisan agendas, our ideological preferences, and our economic interests. I think Pope Francis and faithful citizenship remind us the measure of our lives is how the least of these are doing. And whether that's who pays the price for climate change, who pays the price for failure on COVID, who pays the price for an economic collapse, the least of these are being left behind. And that brings all these issues together.
Karina, how about you? When you think about these issues, when you think about COVID, how COVID has affected your community, how does that affect how you think about this election?
Well, I think COVID has specifically affected the community that I work with. They just have to go out to work. They're a community that is working currently in factories who are, don't have the best measurements and to making sure that they are being safe. We've also seen a lot of more cases within the minority community of COVID, right? So that is alarming. And how are these protocols, taking into account everyone? But I want to talk a little bit about Pope Francis, right, and how he's been talking about the environment. And I mean, he wrote an entire encyclical, Laudato Si. And recently, we as Catholics have seen the climate change that we have, specifically, in California. I mean, it's being loud, and when we have an administration that doesn't seem to really put in an effort and say, okay, let's sit down and really work on what's happening with the environment, but instead pulls away from international policies that could definitely help. I think that that's something that we need to also look into. I mean, for me, I find myself, as Catholic, it's an obligation to care for our common home. And this is what Pope Francis calls us to do. So I think also looking into environmental policies, like, people have said, we have not talked about this. You're right. Sometimes this is to some such a new topic, when in reality, Pope Francis is just shining a light into something that's already been talked about for years.
And in your reporting, how do you see these issues? Karina just spoke about Pope Francis and climate change. Mary talked about COVID, and John did as well. We also see a lot of focus on abortion, on racism, on COVID. How do you see the other issues as well affecting Catholic voters and other voters? Climate change, other issues that we don't hear about as much, and maybe we should.
So the question asker that you referenced, Kim, also raised religious freedom, which is something that I frequently cover and that comes up a lot in conversations that I have with various religious communities. And I would say, painting really a broad picture, among conservatives and those who might be more supportive of President Trump, there's a great sense that Democrats in general are on the offense when it comes to religious liberty issues. They cite, for example, the ACLU going after Catholic hospitals for their policy on sterilization and abortion. They talk about some religious freedom cases that have come to the Supreme Court, like the Little Sisters of the Poor and the Affordable Care Act that I was citing before, the contraception mandate and the Affordable Care Act. The general composite of this is a sense that there's a real possibility that if Democrats take back political power, that conservatives and those who have conservative religious views will be pushed out of the public square, that there's no space in public life for people who hold that view. And I bring that up and sort of give that story from a conservative perspective because I do think that's a really important backdrop to some of the fear that people who have a more conservative perspective are feeling going into this election, looking at a Biden-Harris ticket and feeling this sort of instinctive sense of reserve and unwillingness to support it. On the other side, we also see that there's a lot of concern in minority religious communities around the freedom of those groups to practice and express their belief. Talking, for example, to Muslim voters, also you hear a lot about the supposed Muslim ban that the Trump administration put in place and other types of discriminatory language that Trump has used, for example, around Latinos, not respecting that that's in fact a rich source of religious diversity and invigoration in the United States. So there tends to be a sort of radically different narrative here when it comes to religious freedom and the role of religion in the public square. Depending on where you're sitting, I think there's a lot of fear that one or the other side, one or the other party is really going to push your side out of the public square and that there's no space for a sort of pluralistic coexistence in public life.
I really appreciate you talking about that, Emma. I think that religious freedom is clearly a core issue and driven from a sense of not only of fear, but of responsibility towards building that pluralistic public square that we all want so that we can have our different views in public life and express well. We have a lot of different questions coming in, and we're almost out of time. But I want to go another round on bringing some of the questions that are coming in, not from the political side, but from the Catholic side. We have people here who are saying, shouldn't we be approaching all of these conversations from a place of forgiveness? Others who are saying, why do we care that we're politically homeless? We know we're going to be homeless here in this world. And Jacob says, this election has made it all the more clear how rancorously divided America is, including the church. After the election, what can we do to heal these divisions and make peace and unity in the body of Christ? John, I want to start with you, and I'd love to get around with everybody to get your view of how we should look towards our Catholic faith and how that might help us come to some sort of a unity afterwards.
Well, sadly, it seems to me the polarization in political life is now seeping into ecclesial life. And we don't act like members of the same family. Greg Erwin says we need to remind ourselves we're part of one family and we love each other. It's really hard to make that case in election years. My own sense is you have to go back to fundamentals. You said at the beginning, our faith needs to shape our politics instead of the other way around. I think all of us have to examine our conscience and see, are we working out of what we think our faith requires, the gospel requires, Catholic teaching requires, or are we trying to find within our faith pieces to support our ideological, our partisan, our political agendas? It requires an examination of conscience. The other thing is, as Emma said, we ought to talk to people who disagree. I'm sure there are people who think the initiative should be much more clear about where we are, what we support, and how we ought to go about things. We think we're sadly unique in Washington in trying to build bridges, trying to find common ground, and trying to remind ourselves that we're a divided nation, and a hurting church, but we're one family, and the common good ought to be the goal that we seek. And frankly, that's been left behind, along with a lot of the least of these in this campaign.
Mary, how about you? What do you think about how after this election and how we can in general look to our faith to bring unity to the Catholic community in America beyond partisan and political issues?
Yeah, I mean, other than staying off social media, which generally doesn't tend to lend itself. But, I'll tell you a very quick story. This was in the 2016 primaries for the Republican nominee. And my husband and I were at a Catholic function, those rubber chicken dinner things. And we're standing in a group of maybe 10, 20 people and just chatting about the primaries and asking who people might be supporting, because there were 17 people in the Republican primary, if you recall. And every male in the room over the age of 50 said they were voting for Donald Trump. This is when there were still 17 people in the primary. And I remember my husband and I, we got in the car and said, well, that was weird. But definitely he tapped into a part of the population in the United States that felt very much marginalized and have been called stupid and have been called deplorables. So I think he tapped into, some real anger and hurt from American citizens who are just kind of, going out there, blue collar people trying to do their best, don't particularly want the government to be over involved in their lives. And so he tapped into what was not, I wouldn't describe it as anger. I would describe it more as kind of hurt and resentment. So to recognize that where people may have voted on either side, it's not coming from a place of vengeful hatred. It's coming from a place often of woundedness. And maybe that's something to sort of keep in mind. And then no matter who wins, so say, for example, Joe Biden doesn't win, I think we as a Catholic community, and Kim, you and I have talked about this instance, we need to be at Democratic Party platform meetings, holding their feet to the fire on that abortion plank. And if Donald Trump wins again, he will win because of the abortion plank in the Democratic Party. Because for many Catholics, it's the issue that will make them walk. But just think if we had that collective force and went in there and said, you modify this plank or we walk, and we're serious and we will walk. Cardinal O'Connor did that with the mayor of New York one time when he wanted to have his Catholic high schools promoting contraception. And he picked up the phone, called the mayor and said, I'm closing all my schools at the end of the month. So good luck to you. And the mayor knew he meant it. So I think we as Catholics, we have a beautiful communal voice that can be such a force for good. I don't see that happening. And in fact, on the other side, I'm seeing checklists that people can, use to justify a vote for either candidate, which really aren't helpful. It was one of the things Cardinal Bernardin said he hated that people did with the consistent ethic was to create a scorecard, if you will. So.
Thanks, Mary. Karina, how about to you? What do you think how can we get past woundedness? How can we get past hurt and anger? Should we get past these things? How can we bring Catholic principles into the center of our life and reunify our community?
I think, first of all, we're dealing with a country that's extremely hurt right now with everything that's happening with environment, with racism, with the Black Lives Matter movement, with immigration, with refugees. I mean, these are minorities, and we are constantly living in a state of fear, right? So what happens when you're constantly living a state of fear? You end up, we need closure. We need a country. We need our country back, and we need to start, having these tough conversations, even within our Catholic religion, and saying, okay, what are we doing as Catholics? Pope Francis, says equally is the sacred, are the poor, are those invulnerable, are the marginalized, are the underprivileged. And, John, it is a shame that that specific verse from Gaudium Exulit 101 did not make it into the faithful citizenship of the bishops, because I think it would have spoken a lot of what Pope Francis is bringing, right? And a lot of times we see Pope Francis as, or a lot of people see him as a liberal, when in reality, I say this again, he's only talking about Catholic social teaching from the very beginning, right? We are a church who are for the workers' rights. We are a church, who stand against racism. And I think Pope Francis calls us, specifically on this election, to be vocal, to take action, and, to make conscious decisions and look into our conscience. I think that's something that faithful citizenship also talks about. When you're looking into how to vote, look into your conscience.
Emma, I want to end with you. We're almost to the end of our time. We've talked about the woundedness of our communities, and in your Hunt Prize lecture, you really, I just thought, came to a wonderful place about how we might start to move past the mistrust and the woundedness. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that to help wrap us up.
I feel a lot of conflict as a reporter over two things being true at once. The first is that national politics is very important and affects our daily lived lives as Americans, and that citizenship involves being involved in these issues. And as a journalist, it's my job to report on these issues. But I also think it's true at the same time that having our identity so thoroughly rooted in national political conversation and these partisan identities, these partisan camps, is an active barrier to having a really good life, to building strong local community that's pluralistic and diverse, to finding a sense of faith community that is really rich and can be brought together in all of these ways that we've been talking about. So I'll end with a little story. I have a story coming out this week, hopefully, on Pennsylvania and Catholic voters and the pitch that Joe Biden is trying to make there. And as part of my reporting, I spent time with the IHM nuns who have a long footprint in the city. And one of them talked to me about going to her parish parking lot in 2016 and yanking signs off of people's windshields that said, if you vote for Hillary Clinton, you're going to hell. If you vote for Donald Trump, you're going to heaven. And the way that she explained this, besides that sort of rage that she felt, feeling that this was very much not a Catholic message, was by talking about all of the ministries that the IHMs have in their city, that on a local, personal, one-to-one level, they're trying to reach out and bring women who are unmarried and pregnant into apartments and to care for them for all of their 9 months of pregnancy, that they're trying to create these programs for people who have disabilities, that they have this long infrastructural footprint in their communal life in Scranton that really doesn't have that much to do with left or right or Democrat or Republican. As a reporter, I think it's so important to talk about these policy issues, to talk about these candidates, but ultimately, when you're talking about the stuff of life and the stuff of faith, it's that in Scranton, the stuff that those nuns are doing on a daily basis in their ministries, trying to build community and strengthen the infrastructure around them. I think that's very much more important than anything that will happen R or D in 2020.
I think that's a great way to end this conversation. Thank you so much. And thanks to you all for a principled and respectful and candid conversation. And thanks all of you out there for joining us. At the end of these, I'm always reminded of how much the Catholic community contributes to our public life, bringing principles like the equal dignity of all life at all stages, the centrality of caring for the poor and vulnerable, the dignity of work, the common good to our public life. And in particular, as Pope Francis reminds us, that we're neighbors to everyone. We're called to be neighbors to everyone, especially the most vulnerable among us. There's a lively and robust Catholic conversation about these issues going on at Catholic institutions and journals all over online. And I really encourage you, if you're interested in these topics, to check those out. And I'd like to quickly tell you about a couple conversations that we have coming up. Next Tuesday, Tuesday, October 27th at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, we're going to hold an online public dialogue on election 2020, the moral and political choices, obligations of political winners, losers, and the rest of us. We'll have Dennis McDonough, President Obama's Chief of Staff, Joe Goldman of the Democracy Fund, Sherry Harder of the Trinity Forum, and others. And then on Tuesday, November 10th, a week after Election Day, we'll hold an online public dialogue on faith in the faithful in the 2020 election. What happened, why, and what now? More details on that will be posted on our website. Just a reminder that this discussion will be recorded and posted on our website and social channels for later viewing as well. And we'll also have follow-up resources from the discussion posted there too. Thanks to everyone who helped us on the technical end of this discussion, to my colleagues Anna Misla and Sammy Friedman, and to our partners at the Institute of Politics and Public Service. And finally, please join me in thanking our panel, Karina de Avila, John Carr, Mary Fiorito, and Emma Green, for being a part of this wonderful discussion. Hope you all have a great afternoon. Thank you.